Welcome to the third panel of the day. This is entitled Questions, Comments, and Concerns, of which you might end up having some as you go. So keep track of those for our Q&A session as soon as these speakers are finished. Our first speaker of the day is from Marymount, and it is Anna Cohen.
Hi, so I'm Anna. As you might have heard, I'm from Marymount. I'm a sophomore there. So we probably use the internet every day, whether to look at the news or email your teachers if you're a student, you text your friends. So it's an active tool that we use. Even without the internet, we always look at some form of media, and the results are usually the same. We see the exploitation of the media to harm a population. Women looking at an image of what they want to be changes their own perception of her own beauty as time passes. This idea of altered perception is where the media is connected, exploring how too much technology can have a drastic effect on society, causing a sort of altered, distorted view of oneself. People change due to societal pressure. Similarly, Sylvia Plath's poem, Mirror, which is the basis of my project, which you will hear later on, explores how society forces someone to change themselves because they are not content. Sylvia Plath died in 1963 at her own hands. She suffered from endogenous depression, which led to her sticking her head into an oven, causing both her and her 4-year-old daughter to pass. I find it terrifying that this woman shared such common feelings with many people, even myself. I believe that one of the reasons that this is still an increasing issue is the way that people, especially women, are portrayed in the media. We see the Barbie-esque creature. Women are portrayed with thin, tall, with beautiful hair, a symmetrical face. But in reality, only 5% of the population matches that description, which leaves about 80 to 90% unhappy with the way that they look. I want to emphasize that there is not a significant change in the way that society treats women. Over almost 60 years since this has been written, there has been little change in the media that would suggest that women should start valuing themselves as beautiful. In fact, let's look at some of the media right now. So I found this yesterday. We see these magazines everywhere. Dentist's office, at the doctor's, if you're in an airport and you need something to read. And I think we all know that most of the stuff that's in here is very far from true. I thought that this article was very interesting. It's showing how a woman's body needs to be as perfectly fit as possible after having a child, which is extremely, extremely impossible after that. So kind of thinking how like these societal beauty ideas kind of go into these cultural channels, media, our family, our peers, things that we see every day, and we internalize these messages, which then leads to body dissatisfaction, or kind of feeling okay with ourselves, which usually most of the time isn't what happens. And from that, there are so many bad, real things that happen. We see eating disorders, we see depression, we see all these things that happen, and it's so common. So I made a video. And the purpose of the video I made is to allow others to look at the negative effects of preconceptions, which are aided by technology, and force a change in the way people view themselves and others. It also points out how technology is in every aspect of our lives. Hopefully, as I admit, I'm not the best director or cameraman, so hopefully this works. It will allow us to see that we are a united front that is continuously battered by society. No preconceptions. Whatever I see, I swallow meekly. Just as it is, unmissed by love or dislike. I'm not cruel, only truthful. The eye of the little god, four-cornered,
and an agitation of candles. I'm a martyr. She comes and goes. Each morning it is her face that replaces the giants. In me she's drowned a young girl, and in me an old woman rises toward her day after day.
So that's a general kind of overview of what I think is wrong with our society today, using what happened, a poem from 60 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And next we have from Archer, Erica Dick.
I'm Erica Dick. I go to Archer. I'm a senior, and I'll be presenting on the themes of exploitation and colonization in Wide Sargasso Sea and in Hollywood. Women in 2018 have defined what it means to shatter the glass ceiling. As we've heard already a few times, movements such as Me Too and Time's Up have rippled through the internet, creating waves of action to stand up to sexual harassment. But, of course, to look at every equal and opposite reaction, we have to rewind to those instigating actions. So, one of the front-running events in this overdue shift for change, the Harvey Weinstein accusations. For anyone who needs a refresher on Hollywood's most exiled man, Weinstein was one of the most powerful producers in the business, who dozens of incredibly brave women notoriously accused of rape, sexual assault, and sexual harassment. But as much as Weinstein would probably love to take credit for all the fame he has received, as he is in the entertainment business, he's unfortunately not original in being a world-class misogynist and oppressor. He is the archetypal colonist, both he and also the Englishman in John Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea. The novel Wide Sargasso Sea is a beautifully painful sequel to the classic Jane Eyre, where author John Rhys gives a name and a heart-wrenching story to Antoinette Bertha Mason. Up until this novel, Antoinette's only known as Bertha, a Creole woman who's gone so mad that she supposedly merits being locked in an attic by her husband, Mr. Rochester. Wide Sargasso Sea, however, goes all the way back to Antoinette's dysfunctional childhood and the genesis of her arranged marriage to the Englishman, presumably Jane Eyre's Mr. Rochester. In my essay, I compared the two men through the colonist lens to arrive at my thesis that both Harvey Weinstein and the Englishman follow the abusive blueprint of a colonizer by using their dominance as powerful, rich white men to sexually and emotionally exploit vulnerable women. Yet, when the women in both narratives go to great lengths to burn down Weinstein and the Englishman's empire, their success shows that women must take back control over themselves in order to smash the gender hierarchy. The first cliche in every colonizer's plan: prey on the vulnerable. And this is exactly what both men do. In Wide Sargasso Sea, Rhys paints the Creole community's rejection of Antoinette to exhibit how previous ostracization causes her to crave acceptance and become a prime target for the Englishman's manipulation. As soon as the first line of the novel, Antoinette defines herself as an outsider, narrating, "They say when trouble comes, close ranks," and so the white people did, but we were not in their ranks. Antoinette paints the visual image of the exclusion she grew up facing, leaving her wanting to be loved. And the Englishman capitalizes on this. When he enters his marriage in Dominica, he does it through a critical lens, narrating, "It was all very brightly colored, very strange, but it meant nothing to me, nor did the girl I was to marry. I played the part I was expected to play." He divulges the facade of his kindness and his true colonizer intentions by dismissing his chivalry as a part of the role he must play to take her land and her fortune, and she mistakes his facade as him genuinely caring. He manipulates her comfort with him by extracting a short-lived, sexually driven relationship, symbolizing a metaphorical rape. Antoinette herself implies this when she compares the Englishman to the man who raped her mother, saying, "My mother, sitting in the rocking chair, speaking about dead horses and dead grooms, and a black devil kissing her mouth, like you kissed mine." Just as the Englishman preyed on the vulnerable Antoinette, Weinstein attacked the women in his business, a population that was vulnerable due to their fear of speaking out. Weinstein also utilized the bystanders' fear of him. He had held ultimate power in the entertainment industry and knew that any woman's career rested in his hands, but he also held such a powerful grip on so many other players in his business that he had hundreds of accomplices. Actress Ellen Barkin explains this in a New Yorker article, saying, "The repercussions are real. This fear of losing your career is not losing your ticket to a borrowed dress and earrings someone paid you to wear. It's losing your ability to support yourself, to support your family, and this is effing real, whether you're the biggest movie star or the lowest pay grade assistant." He held his authority in such a dictator-like manner, people were too scared to challenge him. And that is how he kept the intrinsically corrupt corrupt web woven tightly. However, this leads to the second cliche about these manipulative men. They exploit women to repair their own internal damage. Many assume that a sexual assailant's motive derives from a sexual drive, but an article from the Huffington Post explains sex is only part of the reason for sexual assault. It has so much to do with asserting one's dominance and control over a victim. When a man objectifies, gropes, or grabs a woman, he's proving who's in charge. For perpetrators like the Englishman and Weinstein, they try to externally enforce their power because something in their life cultivates a need for recognition. For the Englishman, it's his feelings of inferiority that his father imprints on him for being the second-born son. His flawed connection with his family members skews his understanding of both how to love and how to be loved. Therefore, everything in his life becomes a competition to prove himself to his family, rather than an effort to find meaningful connection. So, when he faces the conflicts of a destructive marriage, he takes the imperialist approach of stripping his wife's identity and wealth instead of retreating home. And Harvey Weinstein's exploitation of women is his affair to repair emotional damage. Surprise, surprise. Weinstein's brother, Bob, describes this, saying that from a young age, Harvey had an overblown personality, a symbol of his narcissism and need for attention. Continuing, it's hard to describe how I feel that he took out the emptiness inside of him in so many sick and depraved ways. As a repeat offender, sexually harassing women was Weinstein's constant way of reestablishing power. His manipulation of power exhibits a circular cause and effect logic, as he exploits women to feel powerful and feel his emptiness, yet it's his power he uses to get away with exploiting these women. The harasser's final act of exploitation supersedes physical or emotional abuse. It's manipulating their prioritized white male perspective to take away their victims' voices. Yet, in these two tales, we see that the women fight back, and that's what takes down their assailants. After the Englishman wrongly believes Antoinette tried to poison him, she really tried to give him a love potion to reclaim his affection, he grows angry at her for threatening his power, so he takes her away from her home and brings her to his home in England. He then locks her away in his estate and pegs her as the crazy woman in the attic, because his perception of her becomes the only perception of her. And she thus becomes the villain instead of the victim, aka victim shaming circa 1840. However, Antoinette dreams of her red dress, whose color symbolizes fire, indicating that the dress is a metaphorical catalyst for burning down his world in order to destroy his agency. However, Antoinette never explicitly throws the candle in the novel, only in Jane Eyre. By ending the novel on Antoinette's imminent action of throwing the candle, Reese makes a social comment on the progression of women's rights. In the 19th century, Antoinette has so little agency she can only dream of a time she will actually undermine her assailant. Yet, this marvelously foreshadows a time when silenced victims do succeed. That time, 2018. Because yes, as an archetypal colonist, Weinstein orchestrated settlements to take away the voices of his victims or blacklist them. Actress Annabella Sciorra explains this when she says, "I refused his advances in 1992 and didn't work again until 1995. I just kept getting this pushback of we heard this, we heard that, you were difficult, and that was the Harvey Weinstein machine." But when victims such as Rose McGowan and Ashley Judd did break through legal ropes and bring their stories to the media, Weinstein lost his company, his reputation, and his power, and thus he went up in flames. Both the Englishman and Weinstein's narratives exemplify the disheartening corruption of colonizers who seek power through capitalizing on the world's brutal gender inequality. And while the victim's bravery to push back offers glimpses of hope for the future, the culture must shift to a time where nobody stands for any type of exploitation. Because as Oprah Winfrey once said, it will be a lot of magnificent women and some pretty phenomenal men who take us to the time when nobody ever has to say "me too" again.
Thank you, Erica. And up next, we have Victor Sweezy from Polytechnic.
I'm Victor. I'm a junior at Polytechnic School, and today I'm going to be reading a memoir piece I wrote about my uncle Rich, as you can see in the title. I love him dearly. We have a very complex relationship, so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I wrote it last March, so some of the references are like a little bit outdated, but I feel like everything's like outdated in like a week these days, because like everything's always happening. So I'm not stressing about it too much. All right. So Uncle Rich carries a cane in his trunk in case his lack of a disability is exposed and he gets towed out of one of those tantalizing blue spots. So when he parks his Prius right in front of R&D Kitchen on Montana for a quick lemonade and a dip duo, it's safe to say he does so with impunity. He's a self-identified ovo-lacto, although he might call me a snowflake for using the word self-identify. My dad points this out to him every Hanukkah when he turns down caviar on his latkes for dietary reasons. We've spent too long joking about the implications of this contradiction around the dinner table, but that's typical. Jokes have 9 lives with Uncle Rich, and contradictions are aplenty. Uncle Rich email subject line highlights. In 3rd place, Pokemon Go and the zombie apocalypse. In 2nd place, points we got into night 7 Hanukkah, Nick Cannon on Planned Parenthood and African American genocide. And far and away the winner, the Civil War was not about freeing the slaves. Lincoln was actually quoted as being abhorrently racist, and Abraham Lincoln was gay. Get the truth about the Civil War in this episode of Historic Truths with Steve R. Piesnick. At around the 7.5-minute mark, I watched the illustrious Dr. Piesnick stutter over a proclamation that Abraham Lincoln's intention was not to free the servants, paused the video, cringed, backed it up 10 seconds, watched it again, paused it, called my dad over, backed it up 10 seconds, watched it again, and wondered how the hell a man I felt so close to could be so irredeemably far away. But that's just the thing about us. Our distance is not absolute, but relative. Our same page lies in 2 different books. Suddenly, you might glance up from the identical numbers at the bottom left corner, drag your gaze away from the identical white margin, scrunch up your eyes to read what is written in the identical 11-point Palatino font, and realize that beneath the surface, these 2 books are so fundamentally different, it's a miracle they can sit on the same shelf without losing their shit. I've learned to keep the books at arm's length, to peruse their pages with quick, fleeting glances and snap their covers closed when the words come into focus, to admire their elegant forms, idly flip their pages, and laugh at their flaccid antiquity. So that's what we do. We speak of new milestones and old television, of Rolling Stones records and road trips and fireworks, a path which carries a 0.25 probability of sparking the classic exchange. So my new receiver is coming in a couple of days. Cool. You should really think about getting a gun. Nah, I don't really think I need one. Everyone needs one. And I never ask why, because if I did, I might hear about how FEMA is going to declare martial law any day now and put us all in internment camps. Or how the globalists are aiding illegal immigration to gain a Mexican voting bloc, which they will mercilessly exterminate using biological warfare once they've secured their power. Which is ironic because Uncle Rich's best friend Willie is Mexican. Which is ironic because Uncle Rich's best friend Willie is a Mexican Trump supporter. Which is ironic because Uncle Rich's best friend Willie, the Mexican Trump supporter, in fact works for him installing HVAC. Which, all in all, is really not all that ironic. Uncle Rich is not a racist. Rather, he is nostalgic for a time when people who are not like him fit more cleanly into little boxes. When Willie composes wandering tales of his experiences traveling the world in the Navy, or that time he met Chargers quarterback Phillip Rivers while installing HVAC, he was just standing right there, man. Uncle Rich is reminded of 70s comedian Cheech Marin, or the Latino kids he went to school with in the 60s. He's reminded of a time when things made sense, when he caught waves off Dana Point with Christian surfer Ron Riddick, and screwed around with the neighborhood kids at the old house on Purdue, and spent his allowance on Jefferson Airplane and the Rolling Stones down at Rhino Records in Westwood. Things have changed since then, and Uncle Rich isn't good at change. After a brief stint at Pitzer College, he watched life drag him back to the 4-mile stretch between the 405 freeway and Ocean Avenue. He watched spring mornings crumble into cloudy evenings, and he slid to the right as his collection of jeans, undershirts, and twill-plaid button-downs grew with a frightening determination. First a whisper, then a roar, then utter domination, and he folded up his plaid and his conservatism, and he zipped it tight into his suitcase and dropped it unceremoniously on the floor of the bungalow behind the Sweezy Institute for Arthritis and Back Pain Relief at 1328 16th Street. Not for lack of means, but a gravitational attraction that kept him within the orbit of his boyhood home. As years passed, his metrosexuality increased at a rate equal to his conservatism, and layer by layer, his paradox formed. He took to wearing a beige apron when he baked panforte in my grandmother's kitchen on weekends, while Rush Limbaugh denounced Obama and all things liberal from the radio. He'd saunter through my grandmother's threshold with a bottle of homemade lemonade in one hand, and his giant gray poodle Chandi's collar in the other. And then Chandi died, and it was her daughter Ellie who accompanied Uncle Rich to Westwood on weekends, and went from Waverly to Waldorf to Weitzman Day School, and my hair passed through phases of short and long and then short again, and all the while he wore his plaid twill with the white undershirt beneath it. And then he met Sigal. She was a beautiful Israeli graphic designer, and he was a lonely right-wing Zionist with a wicked sense of humor, and they wanted to have a baby together. And then she was 6 months pregnant, and she had taken everything she owned out of her apartment, and she called him from the runway at the airport and told him she had a one-way ticket back to Eretz Yisrael. So, on a quiet street in a suburb of Tel Aviv called Ra'anana, she created Danielle Chloe Sweezy Yair, and Uncle Rich loved his daughter like a wave loves the beach, passionately, a little at a time, before it's drawn back out into the open ocean. Seagal had been living in the United States for 20 years on a tourist visa, so when she disappeared, she couldn't come back. This left Uncle Rich with limited options for communicating with his daughter. And for the first few years, he would Skype her every day at 9 p.m. California time, 7 a.m. Israeli time, his dusk to her dawn. In those hopeful years, his relationship with Seagal was not loving, but it was amicable. He was not euphoric, but he was satisfied. He was not her family, but he was her father, and she was his daughter, and that was enough. Now things are different. He calls her Sieg Heil, and she calls him nothing. His life is consumed in a battle for ownership of cartwheels and training wheels and sticky hands and face paint. When he visits Danielle, it's not a time for riding shopping carts down endless supermarket aisles, leaving your cares in the pastry section as you roll past the bananas. If the Israeli social workers, tasked with assessing his abilities as a parent, knew the first thing about love, they could see it plastered on him like a sunburn. They could see it in the way his face glows when he says her name, the soft rhythm of his voice when he talks to her, his happy, sad eyes when he shows us a video they made together for her fake YouTube channel. After the election, liberals said, what kind of person would do this? And I said, look no further than the man in plaid twill and a beige apron who makes me laugh until my face hurts. I said, look no further than the blue handicapped parking spot outside R&D Kitchen. And the man listening to new wave music in the gray Prius, that's your guy. Thank you.
Is Uncle Rich here today? I just wanted to say hi if he was. Thank you very much. And next we have Eli Grossman, also from Polytechnic.
This one. Oh, got it. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Eli. I'm currently a junior at Polytechnic School. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the Archer School for Girls for giving me the opportunity to speak today, as well as my English teacher, Miss Marion, whose classroom the past years has been the fertile soil in which my intellectual ideas have grown. And my last little plug, she's amazing. One of the topics we explored last year in my English class was imperialism and how it both functions through literature and can be resisted by literature. And so what I'd like to talk to you about today are a couple of novels that we read in our English class and my thoughts about how the authors grapple with the issues of imperialism in today's Western society. The true power of literature that I realize is that it's not always in the overt message that the book is trying to get across, but in the way it creates assumptions and relationships to sell the audience a narrative about how the world works. This is especially true in the case of classic texts I read last year, such as Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. On its face, The Heart of Darkness appears to be a cutting critique of the Western colonial project. And when I first read the novel in English class, I was seduced by its seemingly damning expose of European folly. That is, until I read the controversial essay, An Image of Africa, by famed Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe. The article reframed how I saw Heart of Darkness, and suggested that far from being a critique of Western imperialism, Conrad's Heart of Darkness was actually imperialist propaganda par excellence, because of how it belittled the indigenous cultures of the novel. In his essay, Achebe focused exclusively on the loss of complex identity indigenous people face when they are relegated to mere symbols. Conrad's representation of indigenous cultures is undeniably essentialist and paternalistic at the very least. As Achebe argues in An Image of Africa, the manner in which Conrad describes the indigenous people of the jungle creates an image of Africans as subhuman beasts and effectively amounts to racist slander. Achebe notes that Conrad uses vastly different vocabulary and imagery to describe the white Europeans compared to natives. He specifically problematizes Conrad's description of Kurt's native mistress as savage and superb, wild-eyed, magnificent. The immense wilderness seemed to look at her pensive as though it had been looking at the image of its own tenebrous and passionate soul. In this scene, the native woman becomes reduced to a one-dimensional symbol of the primal African jungle. Her eyes, traditionally associated with human intelligence and consciousness, instead become wild, just like the inhuman wilderness around her. She and her brethren lack all trappings of culture and individual identity, and thus are simply animate symbols of the dark inner nature of man that Conrad critiques. Yet Achebe goes on to note that those very same people who would have in reality comprised of Kurtz's savage horde were without doubt the world's greatest masters of the sculptured form. Thus, the supposedly simplistic natives would have been in fact highly developed cultures. The inevitable conclusion that is in order to turn the indigenous people of Africa into symbols for man's inner beast, Conrad has eliminated and essentialized the Congolese, stripping them of the nuances and complexities that make up their human identity. In that sense, Conrad's work carefully manufactured a distorted image masquerading as truth, an act that Achebe believes makes the Heart of Darkness the very essence of imperialist propaganda. However, I don't think Achebe's critique goes far enough in his analysis. The novelist's true imperialist sin is how these symbolic indigenous characters interact with the white protagonist within the story's narrative in ways that make the violent clash between these cultures and Western civilization seemingly inevitable. In that sense, the novel not only slanders and belittles the indigenous, as Achebe claims, but also actively portrays them to the Western audience as a threat to be eliminated. On a narrative level, the indigenous populations exist solely to test the white protagonist, to relegate to symbols of man's supposedly evil nature that the white man must confront. As Marlowe puts it, in the jungle, you fall back on your own innate strength, upon your own capacity for faithfulness. The wilderness is fundamentally a trial of the white man's loyalty to the ideals of his society, whether he succumbs to his own basest desires or if he stays true to his supposed convictions. The representation of the natives as animalistic and uncultured thus plays a central role in destroying even respectable white men like Kurtz's faith in civilization. In Heart of Darkness, the native woman, in all her animalistic glory, exists not to be a human character to interact with, she utters no words, but rather as the antithesis of Kurtz's respectable and undeniably human European life. The fulcrum of the story's narrative structure is that the white man must resist the native woman and her brethren because the brutal savage's way of life is an existential threat to the white man's innately superior civilized state. Thus, while the representation of the Congolese may have been simply offensive in a vacuum, it is the narrative of inevitable conflict between the white man and the savage that makes the novel's message fundamentally violent. The Heart of Darkness actually ends up justifying the West's continued expansion at indigenous people's expense. In fact, it makes the elimination of the indigenous an imperative for white civilization. In this manner, the Heart of Darkness, while exposing some of the hypocrisy and abuses of the present European colonial project, psychologically primes its Western consumers for their next imperialist excursion against the various savages of the world. What I hope to illustrate is that while Achebe is certainly correct that Conrad makes gross oversimplifications and sometimes downright fabrications in his creation of indigenous characters, I'm not convinced that Achebe is describing a uniquely imperialist tool for creating narrative. Instead, it seems to me that at a certain point, any representation of characters from different ethnic groups would never truly capture the entire nuanced complexities of a people. And that essentialization is an inevitable byproduct of representation. There will always be some gap between reality and representation, unless, of course, the author undertakes the Sisyphusian endeavor of describing each individual of that ethnic group in complete depth. Instead, the ethical burden that writers must face is to create narratives that use these representations in ways that do not reinforce hegemonic and negative attitudes about these people, attitudes that can lead to real violence. One such example of positive writing was a less traditional book I read in my English class, The Sympathizer, by Pulitzer Prize winner Viet Thanh Nguyen. Written as part of a response to Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, the film adaptation of Hard Darkness that continues its sort of problematic representation of indigenous people, The Sympathizer turns the tables on the dominant Western narrative. The novel itself follows the story of Southern Vietnamese exiles in America and the aftermath of the Vietnam War, one of the very wars justified by the imperialist ideology popularized by novels like Heart of Darkness. Using techniques of literary representation that bear structural similarities to the way Conrad portrays his natives, Nguyen also largely homogenizes and essentializes the white American men of the novel in order to turn them into symbols for Western imperialism. Be it Claude, Dr. Head, the Great Orientalist, the narrator's old college professor, or even Napalm Ned the Congressman, every single one of the white males of the novel embody the same racist, imperialist, and capitalist ideology that the narrator is in consistent opposition to. If Conrad's natives can be nothing but savages, Nguyen's white men can be nothing but imperialists. In both cases, the entire population is associated with a particular ideology or idea that does not capture its nuanced entirety. The fact that I, a white man, could not find a single white character in the novel that represented my particular life and ideology precisely mirrors how Achebe must have felt reading The Heart of Darkness. In that sense, I too could have easily claimed to have been slandered. The key difference is that I read The Sympathizer from a place of power and socio-political security. Nguyen's novel may have contained essentialized white characters, but white people themselves have already been humanized by centuries of popular literature. Nguyen's reductive representations were punching up, to use an oft-used comedy metaphor, while Conrad's narratives were punching down against an already oppressed and marginalized people. In sum, what truly determined if these essentialized representations of ethnic groups were violent was not the manufacturing of the representation itself, but how that representation was deployed within the novel's overall narrative structure to make a larger point. What we need to foster are not necessarily more accurate representations or some form of colorblind writing, but instead representations and narratives that promote marginalized people's struggles against violence like Western imperialism. Perhaps one day, books with uplifting narratives like The Sympathizer, instead of violent propaganda like Heart of Darkness, will find their place in the common curriculum of American classrooms as well. Thank you.
Eli, I will read The Sympathizer, I promise. So it's a good start for your final call to consciousness. Thank you. And next we have Nicholas Turl from Loyola.
Hello, my name is Nicholas Turl from Loyola High School, and I will be presenting about John Gardner's Grendel and how I interpreted some of the various conceptual layers that are in the book. My paper is titled, I'm Suddenly Awake, Dreamscapes and Prophetic Conditions in Grendel, and in it I analyze this conflicted dream state that the protagonist Grendel is thrown into as he longs for some sort of existential purpose, attempting to reconcile some of his own psychological conflicts that I found really reflected this conflicted subconscious condition of a postmodern world, torn between nihilistic materialism and spiritual longing. So for any of you who aren't familiar with Grendel the novel, it's a conceptual piece written by John Gardner in 1971 that takes the narrative framework of the classic epic Beowulf and adds some new conceptual layers to it. The novel essentially takes many of the elements from the classic tale and adds these existential, postmodern, nihilistic twists to the story. Grendel, an antagonistic force in Beowulf who wreaks havoc on the mead hall of Heorot, a space representative of social and spiritual order in an ancient time, becomes the protagonist in Grendel the novel, and is transformed into a modern existential prophet, thrown by Gardner into this dark nightmare of his own psychological conflicts. Secondly, the ideas of Nietzsche permeate the novel, represented predominantly by the dragon character, who offers a materialistic worldview for Grendel, urging the monstrous prophet to abandon this impulse to search, to long for something beyond the material plane. And as Grendel is hurled into this existential state, forced to discern meaning for himself in a world void of a god who would be able to do so for him, he attempts to find his meaning, seeking answers to the overarching problem of existential purpose. As theologian Thomas Althusser asserts that a uniquely modern religious studies can know the depths of religion only as an archaic, an ancient, or an esoteric world, a world as far removed as possible from modernity itself, and a world which can be entered only by exiting from that modernity, Gardner's use of the epic Beowulf's narrative structure makes perfect sense, in that he is able to exit this state of modernity, enter one of antiquity, and then challenge the various implications of modernity in this prophetic condition through Grendel, recast in the novel as a despairing existentialist. Aaron Hughes, an expert on religious studies, ascertained that the imagination and intuition which define a prophet enabled him to assimilate dreams and visions into a divine message, and that it is through these dream state conditions that one is able to apprehend that a world exists above our own, and that our only access to it is through the images that are the content of prophecy. Thus, Grendel's movement away from the material plane and towards this subconscious dreamscape signals his inherent prophetic impulses, despite this increasingly secularized postmodern culture. And to begin the search for his purpose, his revelation, Grendel travels towards a manifestation of nihilistic thought, as he sank away like a stone through earth and sea toward the dragon. Tangible space is dissolved at this point, and Grendel enters this state of altered consciousness, where his subconscious conflicts can battle for dominance, taking the shapes of disembodied omniscient figures that invoke revelatory awe and fear in the protagonist, as Grendel's knees and insides were so weak at the sight of the dragon that he was forced to drop down on all fours, reducing the protagonist to this level of animal-like inferiority. The dragon offers Grendel this materialistic discourse filled with complex linguistic gestures about universal truths regarding time, gravity, and the futility of human theory. He claims that humans only think they think, and discards the basic notions of free will and intercession through his omniscient understanding of all time, all space, as just one instant. The dragon's materialistic rhetoric certainly aligns with the teachings of Nietzsche, who claimed that God is dead, and that we, this increasingly secularized culture filled with logical reductionist tendencies rather than religious sentiments, caused this death. However, the dragon declares, humans have dim apprehensions that such propositions as God does not exist are somewhat dubious, at least in comparison with statements like all carnivorous cows eat meat. The dragon thus sets this empirical claim against this obviously spiritual one, and claims that the two are equally factual, and that humans disregard the claim about God's death only because of this illogical desire for some kind of immaterial purpose. He then connects his nihilistic idea of God's death to his omniscient understanding of time, attempting to demonstrate to Grendel that God's death was inevitable, that it would always happen, and that it was somehow ingrained in human history before comprehension of the idea was even possible. Therefore, the dragon claims, the causation of God's death is irrelevant because of its nature as ingrained in time. He thus connects the nihilistic reasoning of Nietzsche with his extra-dimensional understanding of time and space, and he offers Grendel one final piece of materialistic advice for his prophetic journey, to seek out gold and sit on it. Following his encounter with the dragon, Grendel not only begins his 12 years of attacks on Harriet, but he also continues to navigate this dreamscape, challenging and testing the dragon's materialistic understanding of the world. Grendel's attacks on Harriet take on new subconscious weight for the prophetic Grendel, though, as he debases Western thought, proves nihilistic reasoning correct, and yet still remains lost in his own mind. While Grendel cannot journey back to the dragon, he continues to prove nihilistic reasoning correct. However, Grendel realizes his hidden appreciation for immaterial values like transcendental beauty when he is unable to kill the Queen of Harriet in what he calls the ultimate act of nihilism. Thus, Grendel seeks an end to this nihilistic dream sequence. As Nietzsche profoundly knew that one can transcend nihilism only by thinking through and beyond it, Grendel hopes to accomplish just that, professing that the only way out of the dream is down and through it. Grendel attempts to reassert a sense of metaphysical order within his conflicted subconscious after meeting with the dragon, as he grows excited at the arrival of Beowulf and the Geats, who arrive on the shores of modern-day Denmark to assist the Danes in warding off this evil, monstrous figure who had inflicted these nihilistic attacks on their mead hall of Harriet, disrupting their sense of order. As Beowulf's presence drew Grendel as the mind of the dragon did once, so does Beowulf represent a manifestation of thought which is equal but opposite to the dragon's. Despite this contradiction, the two exist simultaneously within the prophet's psyche, and thus Beowulf manifests in an inconsistent form, as Grendel describes Beowulf's hand remaining closed like a dragon's jaw in mine, and as Beowulf breathes out fire. Beowulf, similar to the dragon, is this omniscient, godlike character. Unlike the materialistic dragon, though, Beowulf speaks to the permanent, immaterial power of language. His words have such an effect on Grendel that the previously nihilistic prophet is forced to sing, exploring the power of language to transform material reality, an idea that's completely antithetical to the dragon's empiricism. And these contradictory revelations of the dragon and Beowulf cause the prophet Grendel to enter a state of full-blown mental chaos, as he whispers, leering maniacal, "Am I not free as a bird?" He thus questions the very idea of his free will, as this cognitive dissonance caused by these conflicted subconscious beasts breaks down the prophet's psyche. And as a result of this mental turmoil, Grendel approaches the edge of a nightmare cliff, the end to his prophetic dream sequence, in a state of confusion, lacking any sense of purpose which he sought to find through this prophetic journey. After battling with Beowulf and being dominated by this spiritual figure, Grendel's dream ends. He exits this subconscious condition of internal conflicts just as conflicted as he was when he entered, offering no clear revelation, no definite affirmation of divine order, and no apparent transformation on the part of the prophet. His prophetic condition becomes ironic, therefore, in that Grendel fails to enter into the traditional condition of religious revelation, yet his longing for such a state is evident through both his dream state and his encounters with omniscient beasts, the material dragon and the spiritual Beowulf. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and many other traditional prophets who also entered states of visionary stupor, confronting their own conflicts within a dreamlike condition, were able to come out of this state of haziness with an affirmation of divine order, revealing truths about their own God. Grendel is not able to do this, however, as his dream occurs within the confines of a materialistic, secular, postmodern culture. While he is unable to accept the dim reality of scientific nihilism, he's also unable to affirm the presence of a divine figure that has embraced the death of God. Instead, we are left with a condition of unfulfilled prophetic longing. And Grendel's plight comes to represent this remaining impulse in humanity towards a prophetic search, a longing for some kind of meaning beyond the material. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you all for such a thoughtful and dynamic panel. And I'm sure the audience has questions, and I would like to bring you the mic.
Hi, this is a question for Eli. What do you think of the argument that although Conrad describes the Africans, as you said, to be less human than the Victorian Europeans, his portrayal of the happiness of these Africans in their natural setting, in contrast to the horror that Kurtz experiences when witnessing the false social constructs of Victorian Europe, critiques not the Africans, but the, I guess, shallowness of Victorian European society?
Right. So I think in that sense, like, that's why I originally thought the Heart of Darkness was very critical towards European society, and specifically the Belgian Congo and the colonial apparatus there. And so in that sense, I don't think that Conrad's not being critical of European society, but the way his critique functions, the logic in which he comes to his critique, is in of itself a sort of indicative of white supremacy. I think, for example, his images of like happy Africans, for example, Achebe also notes that the way he described these people it's almost like a fetish for him. His repeated use of, for example, the N-word, the way he describes, I think, the whites of their eyes. I'm trying to remember the essay. But specifically, even that the idea that these people could live happily in of itself kind of functions as like, oh, this is like the natural state of man. These people are undeveloped and uncultured. And then even though in the beginning of the novel he does present these people as potentially happy and in like their natural place in the world, he later goes on to explore how these people are in fact grave threats to society and how their sort of uninhibited savagery and their uninhibited desire is in fact the antithesis of Western civilization. And so in that sense, even if the people are happy, they're still a threat to white civilization. I think that perhaps the alternative ending to Apocalypse Now, instead of simply leaving, I can't remember the colonel's name, but instead of the white officer leaving the camp, he actually allows the airstrike to go through and bombs the entire camp out of existence, which I think is an interesting parallel to the modern day U.S. military strategy for dealing with the supposed savages of the world. So in that sense, I do think that Conrad is, to his credit, not uncritical of the European colonization, and that he's not the same sort of traditional, we're helping them out to spread religion and God, we're helping these people. But at the same time, he still functions to support the Western imperialism.
If I might ask a question of Erica. You did offer a very interesting, I would say perhaps sympathetic reading of the psychological background and complexities of both Rochester and Weinstein. I'm wondering, how do you reconcile those sympathetic, kind of journeys into their psychologies or some of the origins of their, shall we say, misbehavior or decisions with their later forms of problematic domination or offenses? Or is that not happening at all?
Well, I think starting off, it wasn't like an intent to say this is an excuse. Like, we can't justify any of this. I think that was like my priority was not looking at how can we say that this is okay, but rather looking at these patterns so we can then change them. Why are men acting like this? Why is this so like really frequent, especially as it starts to be revealed, like a lot that's going on that's actually concealed. And so I think for me, it was looking at, I looked at tons of studies, like not even related to these two men, but just men in general. And so I think that you definitely have to look at the root to fix the problem, but I definitely would not look at the result and say, oh, well, these actions are excusable because these men are sick. I don't think anyone can say that. But that was mostly the intent, is looking at how we can look at the root to then fix the problem more so than how can we justify these actions.
Thank you.
My question's for Nick Turl. But first of all, I wanted to congratulate everyone who presented. I thought that it was just fantastic. Anna and Erica, you killed it. Victor, that was a great memoir. And Eli, you gave me a lot to think about. But for Nick, I was curious what your opinion was about Grendel, and if it was if the author read into Beowulf the nihilism that he describes in his novel as a kind of postmodern reading of the legend, or if it was a kind of spiritual memoir of the artist himself moving toward a discovery of God from darkness to lightness, or in that kind of annihilation of the self. So whether it was, in your opinion, like a postmodern reading of the original legend, Beowulf, or a kind of spiritual memoir. Thank you.
Well, I think that in many ways, Gardner inserted his own self into Grendel, which happens a lot with authors. They, insert their own psychological conflicts or thoughts into their characters in their various literature pieces. And I think that Gardner definitely did that. So he takes this spiritual tale, Beowulf, which was written through the filter of Christian monks, and he tries to reconcile this with the nihilistic truth candidacies that are popping up just as a result of his culture that he is in, the 1970s, and all of that. Like, teachings of Nietzsche definitely affected him. And so I think that Grendel, in a sense, is a way the novel is an attempt by Gardner to reconcile those psychological conflicts. And he doesn't know how nihilism and Christianity can exist simultaneously, and that's part of the reason why Grendel goes into this state of mental turmoil by the end of the novel. So I think that, in a way, the novel doesn't answer the question. There isn't a way that we found yet to reconcile the two opposing ideologies, but I think that what we're left with, as I said, is some kind of hope, or just a remaining impulse, as I said, for a continued search. Even if the answer doesn't lie somewhere near, I think we need to keep searching, and literature is one way that we can access the through line between these opposing binary pieces.
We've got another one back here.
Michael Jeffy, the Buckley School, and I just wanted to send my regards from Mrs. Jaffe, Victor, and Eli, who taught them in 7th grade at Polytechnic, my wife. And so I'm here as a sort of emissary, among other capacities. I thoroughly enjoyed all of your, and I actually love a copy of all your essays I've heard so far. But I just wanted to especially give a shout out. Eli, why do you think Heart of Darkness is still taught in unproblematic ways? So, like, for instance, without the sympathizer or without things fall apart in the American high school classroom?
Well, I think that what makes Heart of Darkness such a difficult book is that it's extraordinarily well written. Conrad is a master of language, and the way he presents his story, it is written in a way that seems almost designed to become a great work of literature on the level of like Dickens or Shakespeare. And so in that sense, it provides a lot of pedagogical tools for English teachers to make, if you want to analyze imagery, the Heart of Darkness is just replete with it. But I do think that it is problematic to present Heart of Darkness as a great work of literature without challenging it. So Achebe in his article says that we should not actually put the Heart of Darkness in the category of a great work of literature. I don't actually agree with Achebe on this note, simply because that if we start, that I think that just because a piece of literature is problematic and that problem should be exposed, I think part of the value of an English education is learning how to expose the problems in literature. And that's very easy to look at a poster on the wall that's like, Uncle Sam, like, recruit you for the U.S. Army. And it's like, oh, that's propaganda. But that we don't necessarily conceive of that propaganda has kind of, it still exists, but it certainly pales in comparison to the more subtle propaganda that we get through literature today. And learning how to expose that propaganda and expose the hidden agendas behind many of these works of literature are an incredibly valuable tool for English students to learn. That's why, and I love Miss Marion because she's really taught me, put me on that journey. So did that answer your question? Yes. Okay.
Any others? Oh, wait here. Excuse me, please.
I think I have less of a question than a comment, which comes from what you're saying. As Eli's teacher, we struggle each year with Heart of Darkness, and it's a question that I think for all English departments, every year there's pushback to us to get rid of things like Heart of Darkness, and every year we push to keep it because of the reasons he's saying. But they're conversations that I know I have with my students each year. Are we doing more damage to you by teaching it before we get to the part where we really question the validity of texts like this and texts with problematic representations? I keep coming down on the side that it's important to teach students how to read problematic books, but are we doing damage through teaching them to students for whom the representation is threatening? And it's a question that I want to keep discussing with students, with other departments. Can we really excise all the problematic books? Because they're all problematic. They're problematic to women, they're problematic to different racial groups. And so the question is kind of how do we deal with that? And I know I just turned this into a statement, but I know Eli just responded to it. I would be interested to hear how the others of you up there do respond to that. Do we cleanse our departments of difficult literature, or do we figure out a way to continue to teach them?
Well, I think that literature has kind of become this mirror of, society, but also a through line or a medium in which we can see the darkness. And it's easier to see darkness, is what I found in literature, and that could be reflected through Heart of Darkness and many other works. But being able to attack those dark conditions and nihilistic conditions and evil conditions really allows us to recognize the necessity of other transcendent aesthetic qualities that literature and art has always pushed forward in society. So while a lot of the times these novels, pieces of literature reveal the ills of society, I think that it's good, and we have to keep attacking them, analyzing them, in order that we can, realize the necessity of beauty and aesthetic quality through the contradiction of the two.
And yeah, can I ask you to speak to that too, because I think your story speaks a lot to this kind of, acceptance of or reconciliation of difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key to analyzing problematic literature or having relationships with people who you might consider problematic is just context. I mean, I hope I gave enough context so why I don't just write off Uncle Rich and condemn him as a radical nationalist or whatever. But in the same way that Eli gave, and when we give context about Heart of Darkness or something like that, we're able to see it for what it is. And in the same way that I think the appropriate way, I mean, obviously the Confederate monuments is a big hot button issue right now. I think providing context with those would be a really, when we just erase things from our past that we consider problematic, we're erasing our history that of the problematic past of our civilization. And when we do that, I think there's a quote, I might butcher it, but those who forget history are bound to repeat it. When we erase and censor our history, we're erasing the very events that we should be learning from, and I think that would be really detrimental to our education.
I also think that in the whole part of discussing literature or a huge part, especially here at Archer, is to have a classroom discussion on it. and so much of it is how you interpret a text. Every person's going to interpret a text differently. And so I specifically feel like, I think with this text that I even looked at, there were millions of different interpretations, and just being able to discuss it. I mean, there's certain texts that are, of course, across the board, the things that are fundamentally wrong, killing, definitely a lot of the racist texts, all those things, but a lot of the things that not everyone picks up on that are difficult for some people, I think it's really important to keep those alive in the classroom, because different people are going to have different things to say based on their own identity, and I think that's something that if you get rid of a text, you lose that global conversation, and it becomes something that you kind of just throw in the back, and it's just kind of like covered in dust, and it's not, I mean, when does it come up again? Until it's like exactly what you said, until it's repeated, and then is that just like a cycle that keeps happening? And then, yeah, I think you lose a lot of the validity in any text, because if it's so easy to bury, then what's the point of it?
Good comment. I think also that I think there certainly is the way you teach a text is especially important. I know for me it was very effective so we learned about we read the image of Africa after Heart of Darkness, and so while that might have been, in that sense, there was no forefronting of the sort of racism that we were supposed to. So we didn't go into Heart of Darkness expecting a racist, imperialist novel. So in that sense, it may have been, I think, I can't speak to this because, you know, I'm come from a place of privilege. I'm a white man in a elite liberal society. But that other students that may have not been able to access that privilege may have had problems or not enjoyed reading the novel at first because they would have seen the sort of racism and misogyny that are necessarily, I guess, evident at first glance from a reader who's not prepared for it. But I actually found that for me personally, that was actually the most powerful part of reading about Hard Darkness, because the way I read it and the way I at first bought into it and then realized later how problematic it was what really primed me to be prepared, right? And so in that sense, reading these problematic texts is exactly the text we should be reading, right? It's all well and good to read, you know, perfect texts, but at the same time, it's the problematic ones that we end up having to be prepared for in our lives. So yeah, so last 2 cents.
Yeah, maybe. Let me. I have one question for Anna. First of all, I loved what you did with your film. That poem is a favorite of mine, and to kind of connect it to technology and the mirror being kind of parallel to us looking at our phones and kind of seeing ourselves there. I guess my question is one about Plath, and that poem, and maybe some of her other work that you may have encountered is, you know, it's very confessional poetry, but do you feel like Plath in that poem or in other work is she challenging there with that, and how does that come out in the poem as opposed to being simply a poem of despair?
Well, I mean, she does focus a lot on kind of how she's upset with the way things are, and we see in her poem, especially in Mirror, she starts out and she's talking about what she sees. She's a young woman, she's beautiful, and she's very happy she's somewhat happy at first, and then she looks into a lake, and when you look into a lake, your reflection changes. There's currents, there's riptides, and that's when she takes action in a way. You know, she gets angry, she slaps the water, she sees her face change. And I think that when she hits the water and that changes, we see this aggression come out, we see that change. And because there's so much anger and there's so much sadness, there's so many emotions happening, we see this kind of stumble into action. Whether it's intentional or not, whether it's to inspire other people, it happens, and it's meant in a way to help. Thank you.
Well, let's give a round of applause for this wonderful panel. Thank you all so much. We will be taking a 5-minute break. Come back for the next one. 5 minutes.